Hey everybody, Rob Orgel with BMG. In this video, we're going to be reviewing the Ruger American Predator. Now, is this a good rifle or is it just a cheap, everyday, run-of-the-mill, typical rifle we're finding over at Sportsman's Warehouse? Well, personally, I'll save my thoughts for the end. Let's start with our tech specs. I don't like going too deep into tech specs because Google will answer those questions for you, but let's get into it real quick. Typically, you're going to find an MSRP of around 620 to 700 and change. For weight, you're looking at 6.1 to 6.5 pounds. It is factory threaded, which is a major perk. Its caliber offerings are going to be 22 250, 6mm Creedmoor, 6.5 Creedmoor, 243 Winchester, 7mm 08, 308, 6.5 Grendel, 223, 204, and the 350 Legend. This one you see here in front of you is a 6mm Creedmoor. So now that we're done with the boring stuff, let's talk about what I like about the Ruger American Predator. First and foremost, accuracy. I have had so many of these rifles and so many clients with these rifles, and very often they surprise me with an incredible level of accuracy. I cannot tell you how many times fresh out of the box one of these rifles has shot a .2 or a .3 inch group. And that's impressive at 100 yards. What's more impressive is at 500 yards, I've seen multiple cases of 2.5 inch or 3 inch groups with these rifles. So accuracy wise, it's just phenomenal. Of course, it's a factory rifle, so the bolt isn't really all that smooth, and there's some other drawbacks to having a factory rifle at this price. End state is a few small modifications can make it feel like a much more custom type rifle. An enlarged bolt handle, a aftermarket trigger, or even a chassis really helps that. So accuracy wise is really the forefront of why I love these rifles. Next is going to be factory threaded. So depending upon which caliber you're buying will dictate the thread pitch of the rifle you're picking up. If you're looking at the 6mm Creedmoor, it's going to be the typical 5/8 by 24. This allows you to put on your recoil reducing muzzle device or your suppressor adapter or your direct thread suppressor. Big fan of running a suppressor on a precision gun. Next, it has a factory rail installed. Now with any factory rail, I'll always recommend to people on the range, after they get it zeroed, make sure you Loctite all of that down. And they say, well, I just zeroed it. I don't want to Loctite it. Why not Loctite it first? Well, first we're testing. Once the rifle proves its worth and that it's capable, then we want to go back and Loctite and then confirm our zero. So underneath we've got 4 screws here on the mount. And if you trust the factory to Loctite it for you, then we'll see if that works out for you. If you do your homework, you'll pull those screws out and Loctite them one by one so that they don't come loose when you're shooting later on and you're expecting to take your deer and your scope starts wiggling around. So know that about the Ruger. It's a good idea to Loctite those. Next, you have your safety on the tail end here, and I personally don't use safety on bolt action weapons. I don't like leaving a round inside of a bolt action weapon, so I leave it off safe at all times. Also, I use a modified position called bolt overwatch when I'm preparing my weapon for engagement, so there's no possibility it can go off. On the trigger is not the worst trigger out of the box. I will say it's also not the best. So I like putting Timney triggers inside of my weapons, and you'll see a heavily upgraded one or two behind me where I've made a lot of modifications, and that's going to be the trigger, the bolt handle, and the chassis. The reason why I think the chassis is so important is adjustable cheek weld. So what you'll find on the Rugers is there's not a substantial cheek weld. A lot of the time people don't actually know what cheek weld is, and they like to float their head above the stock, and that's good enough to harvest a deer at 200 yards. But when you actually start seeking real precision, you have to become intimately knowledgeable with good cheek weld. This creates your consistency behind the weapon, and that's what creates accuracy. So while I'm telling you I can get .2s and .3s out of these weapons, it's not necessarily in the factory setup. It's often in the chassis with a good cheek weld, and that's where you'll see the MDT chassis behind me. So it's a good idea to consider that. If you don't want to spend that kind of money, what I'll do in classes is educate people on building their yoga mat. So we'll literally take yoga mat pieces, cut it up, fold it over, and then tape it to the tail end of the stock so they've got a good place to rest their cheek so they can maintain that consistency. So you don't necessarily need to spend a whole bunch of money to get accuracy out of the weapon. You just need to invest the time and set up the weapon appropriate to you and your body type. So chassis or cheek weld. The next is kind of like a hidden thing. Like most manufacturers, there's a bunch of sub-generations of different rifles, and often we don't know that. So on the 6.5, the 6, and the 308, they used to have a rotary style magazine, and it used to hold, I believe, 3 or 4 rounds. And I've actually had those magazines fail a few times, and now you'll see they're much more into the AICS pattern magazines. So it comes with like a 3-round magazine or a 2-round. It's a low capacity, but now you can pull this magazine out and put a standard AICS magazine from Magpul or MDT or whomever and be able to run your gun with 10 rounds or 12 rounds instead of the limited 2 or 3 or whatever the capacity is of your specific rifle. If you look at the 223s, the 204, and the 6.5 Grendel, those take AR style magazines, and to me that's a big perk. I'm not really a huge fan of running AR calibers and bolt action guns unless it's like a trainer. I do have a 5.56 rifle in that setup for a trainer, which is great for a first timer or someone who's a little bit younger. It helps them get on track and understand how to be precise, and it keeps it much more into a budget. Another good thing about this rifle is while it's so cheap and so accurate, it's a really good test bed. So when you say, I'm not sure if I want a 204 Ruger, should I get one? Well, for $600, you can buy that rifle, take the scope off of something else, and now test that caliber. So it creates a really good options for you and your testing futures. So all in all, I think the Ruger American Predator is one of the best out-of-the-box guns. And even though its price point is relatively low and there are many others far more expensive, I find this thing to be incredibly accurate, and I don't see a need to go much fancier. When you see the added features, that's where you'll find the argument about a smoother bolt, factory trigger, cheek weld, folding chassis. There's a lot of things that are added features that make a fancier gun worth it for sure. However, accuracy-wise, if you're willing to put up with the rougher bolt and other things, I think it's a phenomenal gun, especially given the price point. So all in all, Ruger American Predator, a big go in my book. All right, so let's review a couple of my favorite features. So let me take the stock one, put them aside, stop moving. All right, and this is one of my modified rifles. So you'll see there's a lot of different features on this rifle. I'll start from the front and work my way back. So I've got a suppressor on mine, obviously, and my suppressor in this case is the Dead Air Nomad L, and it's also the titanium model. So it's very light and incredibly quiet. You'll see I've got a free-floating chassis, obviously, and this is the MDT ESS chassis, which they've discontinued for the Ruger American Predator. There are still other options still available, but the reason I chose this one is it's very robust in the kind of things that I need out of my weapon. The other ones lack some of those features, but are still very capable chassis. And then you see I've got a rail section under here. This is how I like to attach bipods. I like to have quick removable systems, the B&T Atlas bipod, because it comes with a quick remove system. So I can pass that bipod around to other systems. Underneath, you'll see that I've got an Arca Swiss adapter. This allows me to lock into a tripod very firmly and very quickly. Next, you'll see the magazine well. This takes the AICS pattern magazines. If you take your factory magazine, it will not fit in this chassis. The reason is because it only holds 2 or 3 rounds. And this guy needs like a minimum of a 3 or 4, I believe a minimum of a 5-round magazine, don't quote me. I put 10-round magazines in all my weapons just because I like having that added capability. On top, you see I'm mounted with a 5x25. This is the Leopold Mark V HD, again 5x25, and there are several reticle patterns available. Now you'll see from Anarchy Outdoors an oversized bolt handle. This gives me that leverage. Therefore, it feels a lot more like a custom rifle or something a bunch smoother because I'm getting better leverage as I run my bolt. I find it important to run your bolt fast and aggressive, and having this oversized knob makes that a whole bunch easier. You'll also see that the safety mechanism on the trigger has been removed because this is a Timney trigger. The Timney trigger is around $150-ish, and it really reduces the weight and makes for a clean break, and I obviously find that to be important in precision rifle training. Now, as I mentioned earlier, cheek weld is super important, and on this chassis, not only can I control the height of the cheek weld, but I can also shift it from side to side. What makes that so important is keeping your head upright as opposed to leaning your head over the gun. So if you're going to do a chassis, it's really nice if you can shift it to the side and keep your head more upright. If you're not doing a chassis and you're going back to the yoga mat technique, keep in mind that as you're building that stock up, you don't want to build it out because that means you have to lean your head over it as you mount that rifle. So when you're building that stock, build straight up the best you can. One trick is to make about 1.5 to 2 inch strips and then just stack them on top and duct tape them. On the tail end, you'll see an adjustable length of pull. This is so that you can increase the length of your weapon. Personally, I find my rifles to be very far forward. The reason behind that is I shoot in a very different technique than most people. I don't blade my body when I shoot square behind the gun, whether it's a precision rifle or belt fed or pistol. So this is kind of get into the Rob techniques. Now, the butt pad that can slide up and down is hugely valuable. This allows me to lift it up to keep recoil directly in line with the action, therefore reducing felt recoil. So this is just a couple little doohickeys that I've put on my weapon that I find make me more successful with it and particularly more repeatable. But there are tons of manufacturers out there that make chassis and accessories for this weapon because it's a very popular rifle. So this is my setup. Hopefully you get to enjoy yours the same way I've enjoyed mine, but the end state on the Ruger American Predator is it's an absolutely must-have.